Hello everyone, it's Bigfoot Theory here, and today we're venturing into what might be the most overlooked Bigfoot territory in all of North America, Wyoming. While researchers flock to the Pacific Northwest and California, Wyoming sits quietly in the shadows, harboring some of the most compelling Sasquatch encounters on record. What makes Wyoming particularly intriguing isn't just the quality of sightings reported there, but the state's unique combination of factors that create perfect conditions for large, undiscovered animals. We're talking about a state that's roughly the size of the United Kingdom, but has a population smaller than most major cities. Wyoming has vast wilderness areas, minimal human presence, and terrain so rugged and remote that new species are still being discovered there. Today, I want to examine two particularly compelling reports from Wyoming's Park County, both near Yellowstone's eastern entrance. These two encounters, separated by just a few years but sharing remarkable similarities, paint a picture of intelligent creatures thriving in one of America's last true frontiers. Before we dive into these specific encounters, let's talk about why Wyoming represents ideal Bigfoot territory. First, consider the sheer scale of wilderness. Wyoming contains over 62 million acres. That's roughly 48% of the state being public land. The greater Yellowstone ecosystem alone encompasses over 20 million acres of interconnected wilderness. Unlike the Pacific Northwest, where logging operations and increasing development fragment habitat, Wyoming's wilderness areas remain largely untouched. These are million-acre stretches where you could walk for weeks without seeing another human. For a species that has evolved to avoid human contact, this represents sanctuary on an almost unprecedented scale. The elevation profile is crucial too. Wyoming's terrain ranges from high desert basins at 3,000 feet to mountain peaks exceeding 13,000 feet. This creates diverse ecological zones within relatively short distances, everything from sagebush steppes to alpine meadows to dense coniferous forests. A mobile species could follow seasonal food sources and temperature changes across these elevation gradients, much like elk and other large mammals do. Water sources are abundant and reliable, with the Continental Divide running through the state, creating numerous river systems and mountain lakes. The Green River, Snake River, Yellowstone River, and North Platte River all originate in Wyoming, providing natural corridors for wildlife movement. Perhaps most importantly, Wyoming has the lowest population density of any state, fewer than 6 people per square mile. Vast areas of the state see no human activity for months at a time. If you're a large animal trying to remain hidden, Wyoming offers a perfect combination of abundant resources and minimal human interference. Our first case takes place on July 14, 2000. This report was submitted to the BFRO by witness Paul N. This encounter occurred about 30 to 40 miles west of Cody, Wyoming, along the highway leading to Yellowstone's east entrance. This area is prime Sasquatch territory if these creatures do exist. Paul is an experienced outdoor enthusiast who finds himself stuck in tourist traffic late in the day. Rather than to fight the congestion, he made a decision that would change his perspective forever. He pulled off at the roadside pullout and decided to explore an unmarked trail heading north into the wilderness. The setting here is crucial to understanding this encounter. We're talking about intermittent timber with rocky outcrops. This is great terrain for large creatures who want to use natural cover to observe human activity. This area is well known for grizzly activity, so Paul was carrying bear spray and was alert to wildlife presence. About half a mile from the road, still within earshot of highway traffic, Paul began experiencing what could only be described as a systematic stalking behavior. First, he heard rocks rolling downhill ahead of and above his position, maybe 50 to 100 yards away. As someone familiar with wildlife, he didn't immediately panic. This could easily be deer or other common game animals. But then the pattern became more disturbing. While resting on a rock ledge with a clear view of the surrounding valley, Paul heard something moving through the underbrush on a steep, timber-covered slope. He could distinguish the pattern of something walking through the trees, not running, not panicking, but deliberately moving parallel to his position. Here's where this creature's intelligence component becomes clear. When Paul started hiking again, he immediately heard movement in the brush below him, as if whatever was there was pacing his movement. When he stopped, it stopped. When he moved, it moved. This isn't typical animal behavior. This suggests conscious tracking and surveillance. This stalking behavior nearly continued for another mile as Paul made his way back toward the highway. About a quarter mile from his vehicle, something ran across rocks from his position. By this point, Paul was understandably apprehensive and decided to turn around to see if he could spot his tracker. What he saw defied conventional explanation. At 60 to 70 yards distance on a rocky slope, adjacent to heavy timber terrain, Paul observed a large upright figure. The moment it realized it had been spotted, it immediately jumped into cover and disappeared. Paul is very specific about what he observed in that brief moment. The creature was definitely upright, bipedal, not quadrupedal. He could clearly see two limbs off the ground that appeared more like arms than legs, hanging down the sides rather than in front, as you might expect from a bear rearing up on its hind legs. The creature was brown with very long hair, longer than typical bear fur. Paul specifically noted that when it jumped into cover, the hair swayed to one side from the sudden motion, suggesting hair length of a foot or more. Paul got a good look at the facial structure. He described it as long and somewhat flat, distinctly non-ursine in appearance. Having seen bears at similar and greater distances, Paul was confident that this was not a bear. Our second encounter occurs on November 2nd, 1997, just a few years earlier, but in the same general area. This report comes from our witness, P.N., who at the time was cutting firewood with his brother in a designated timber cut area roughly halfway between Cody and Yellowstone. The location is significant. They were working south of the highway, very near the north bank of the North Fork in the Shoshone River. This is the same river system mentioned in our first encounter, suggesting that these creatures could potentially use these waterways to travel, or they could be from the same tribe. The terrain description is crucial. The timber in this area wasn't dense, affording good views of high north-facing mountain slopes south to the river. This open visibility is what made this sighting possible, but it also suggests the creatures felt confident enough to be active in areas with limited cover. Shortly before sundown, P.N. noticed movement high up on the slopes across the river. His initial assumption was that it must be a bear or elk, standard wildlife in the area. When his brother fetched binoculars from their pickup truck for a closer look, the encounter took a dramatic turn. Through these binoculars, his brother was startled at what he saw. Rather than just jumping to conclusions, he handed the glasses to P.N. and asked him to take a look. Unfortunately, by the time P.N. got the binoculars up, the creature had disappeared into the tree line. But this encounter wasn't over. Soon after, P.N. spotted the creature again, this time lower down on the slope in the clearing, moving steadily downslope toward the river. The creature was estimated to be at about a quarter-mile distance, but it was moving closer. This time, P.N. got an excellent view through the binoculars. The creature was definitely upright, walking on two legs for over 100 yards without ever dropping on all fours. The estimated height was between 6 to 10 feet, massive by any standard. But here's what makes this slightly particularly compelling. P.N. describes this creature as appearing almost obese, covered in dark hair with exceptional mass and bulk. This wasn't the lean, athletic build people often describe when they encounter a Sasquatch. This encounter appeared to have the body composition of an animal that has been feeding well, exactly what you might expect from a creature thriving in an abundant habitat. The encounter concluded with an auditory component that adds another layer of authenticity about half an hour near the visual sighting. As the witnesses were loading their truck in near darkness, they heard what P.N. describes as a high-pitched eerie squealing noise from a few hundred yards upriver. P.N. is very specific about what this wasn't. It wasn't an elk, despite being the right time of year for elk vocalizations. As someone familiar with the local wildlife sounds, his elimination of known animals carries significant weight to it. When we analyze these two encounters together, several crucial patterns emerge that support the presence of intelligent, unknown primates living in the wilderness of Wyoming. First, both encounters demonstrate sophisticated awareness of human activity. In the first case, we see systemic tracking and surveillance behavior. The creature was clearly monitoring Paul's movements while remaining concealed. When discovered, it immediately sought cover rather than fleeing in panic or becoming aggressive. In the second case, this creature was comfortable enough to be active in relatively open terrain during daylight hours, but still demonstrated awareness of being observed by moving into tree cover when first spotted. Second, both encounters show creatures using terrain to their advantage. The rocky outcrops and intermittent timber in the first case provided perfect concealment for stalking behavior. The high mountain slopes in the second case offered both vantage points and escape routes. Third, both witnesses eliminated known animals based on specific behavioral observations. Paul noted that bipedal locomotion and distinctive hair movement. PN observed sustained bipedal walking over 100 yards and body mass inconsistent with known regional wildlife. Fourth, the geographic proximity and similar habitat preferences suggest that these aren't isolated incidents, but rather evidence of an established population using consistent territory. The location of both encounters along the passageway between Cody and Yellowstone's east entrance is particularly significant. This area represents a natural wildlife highway connecting the high-altitude ecosystems of Yellowstone with the lower elevation habitats of Bighorn Basin. Yellowstone National Park itself encompasses over 2.2 million acres of pristine wilderness. For a mobile species, this represents an enormous territory with virtually unlimited resources and minimal human interface. The North Fork in Shoshone River, mentioned in both encounters, flows directly from Yellowstone's high country down through the Absaroka Mountain. If Sasquatch does exist, they would likely use the same natural corridors following established game trails and river systems that provide both concealment and access to diverse food sources. What makes Wyoming intriguing from a cryptozoological perspective is how little systemic research has been conducted here compared to traditional hotspots like the Pacific Northwest or the Rocky Mountains. The state's vast wilderness areas remain largely unexplored by Bigfoot researchers, despite offering ideal habitat conditions. Consider this: Wyoming contains portions of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, the largest nearly intact ecosystem in the northern temperate zone. These are millions of acres where apex predators like grizzly bears and wolves still control their territories, and wildlife behavior and patterns remain largely undisturbed by human activity. Perhaps more importantly, Wyoming's human population remains concentrated, with few urban areas leaving vast stretches of wilderness essentially uninhabited. Unlike other western states, where recreational use has increased dramatically, much of Wyoming's backcountry sees minimal human visitation due to difficult access and harsh weather conditions. Winters routinely see temperatures below -20 degrees Fahrenheit, with deep snow lasting for months. Any species surviving in this environment would need exceptional cold adaptations. The thick, long hair observed in our first encounter makes complete sense in this context. Extended hair length provides isolation, while the brown coloration offers camouflage against the mixed forest and grassland environments typical for this region. Larger body mass provides better heat retention, while increased fat reserves support survival during harsh winters when food sources become scarce. Unlike the Pacific Northwest, where logging roads provide access to remote areas and recreational use has increased dramatically, much of Wyoming's wilderness remains genuinely difficult to access. Many areas require multi-day hikes on horseback travel, meaning they see perhaps a few dozen human visitors per year. The primary challenge is the sheer scale of potential habitat. With millions of acres of settled terrain, systemic surveys become practically impossible. Weather conditions also create significant research challenges. Winter temperatures and snow conditions make fieldwork dangerous or impossible for several months out of each year. Even during summer months, high elevation areas may be accessible, but only for brief periods. These Wyoming encounters suggest that Bigfoot research has been too narrowly focused on traditional hotspots while ignoring equally promising territories. Wyoming's combination of vast wilderness, minimal human presence, and diverse ecosystems creates conditions that could support stable populations of large unknown primates. The behavioral patterns documented in these encounters systemic stalking, intelligent use of terrain, and apparent awareness to human activity suggest creatures that have successfully adapted to their environment and developed sophisticated survival strategies. For researchers interested in expanding beyond traditional study areas, Wyoming presents unique opportunities. This state's large wilderness areas offer chances of extended field studies, while the sparse human population means less interference from recreational users and local authorities. The evidence from these two encounters, combined with the state's exceptional habitat conditions, suggests that the state deserves serious consideration as prime Sasquatch territory. We're looking at a region with millions of acres of pristine wilderness, minimal human interference, and abundant water sources, and diverse ecosystems that could easily support populations of large unknown primates. The behavioral patterns documented in these reports, intelligence, stealth, and sophisticated use of terrain, indicate creatures that aren't just surviving in Wyoming's wilderness, but are actively thriving there. The variation in physical descriptions between encounters suggests possible population diversity, while the geographic clustering indicates established territorial use. Perhaps most importantly, the lack of research attention Wyoming has received means we may be overlooking one of North America's most important cryptozoological regions. While researchers continue focusing on well-documented areas like the Pacific Northwest, Wyoming sits quietly in the background, harboring secrets that could revolutionize our understanding of North America's unknown primates. The next time someone asks where Bigfoot might be hiding, don't just point them to the forests of Washington or Northern California. Consider Wyoming, America's last great frontier, where vast wilderness areas and minimal human presence create perfect conditions for creatures that prefer to remain hidden. These encounters remind us that the most compelling evidence often comes from the most remote locations, documented by credible witnesses who weren't looking for fame or attention. Wyoming may be the least populated state in America, but these reports suggest it might also be home to some of the continent's most exclusive residents. As always, I've linked the original reports that are on the BFRO's website down below in the description so you can check them out for yourself. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.